In 2002, Soundgarden and Rage Against the Machine fans were over the moon with excitement over songs finally being released by Audioslave, a brand new combination of Rage's rhythm section fronted by Chris Cornell, Soundgarden's guitarist and vocalist. The second single released under this new banner, titled Like a Stone, would prove to be the band's most successful song in its 7-year history, and well deserved. Not only is it melodically hypnotic and dynamically effective, and not only is Chris Cornell's vocal performance characteristically unmatchable, but the poetry on paper, the lyrics themselves stand out as beautiful art all on their own. Now, as they do center around the concept of death, fans are more or less accurate to deem Like a Stone as a dark song. However, a deep look into these verses reveals them to be so much more. They are morbid and sad, yes, but yet they're beautiful and touching all the same. But that's a line of thought we'll revisit towards the end of the video, after we've analyzed the lyrics close enough to make our final judgments on the overarching meanings and themes behind them. Now, to begin with, and just as hinted at, on the surface, the story in Like a Stone being told is from the point of view of a protagonist contemplating his own death, or more accurately, where he'll be after his death. It's a song about concentrating on the afterlife you would hope for, Chris would once say in an interview, rather than the normal monotheistic approach, where you work really hard all your life to be a good person, and a moral person, and fair and generous, and then you go to hell anyway. Expanding on this explanation, Chris would get into more specifics with another interviewer, saying, "It's a guy sitting in a hotel room contemplating death, and then coming up with an image he likes, going with the philosophy of, maybe when you die, if you've been good enough in your life, you get to go somewhere you remember that's really cool." Now, all things considered in hindsight, which is, with the power to now look back through history, while reading Like a Stone's lyrics, one can't help but to wonder if they're meant to be the thoughts of some random character Chris made up for the sake of a song, or if they're actually about Chris himself. But again, this is a question we'll have to return to after we've analyzed them. On a cobweb afternoon, they begin, in a room full of emptiness by a freeway, I confess I was lost in the pages of a book full of death, reading how we'll die alone, and if we're good, we'll lay to rest anywhere we want to go. So, as Chris said in the quote we just went over, our story begins with our protagonist sitting in a hotel room on a cobweb afternoon, an incredibly poetic line to describe a day of weariness if there ever was one, and reading a book he describes as full of death. Now, that book is likely the Bible, as virtually every hotel room comes equipped with one, and the fact that Chris uses the word confess within this stanza only adds validity to the proposition, acting as sort of a dactylic hint, if you will. But regardless, what matters here is that our main character is contemplating his own mortality and doing his best to take comfort in the belief that after he dies, his soul will continue on in a peaceful place of his own choosing, his own personal heaven. And in the next lines, the chorus, he tells us where that heaven is, writing, "In your house I long to be. Room by room, patiently, I'll wait for you there like a stone. I'll wait for you there alone." So then, our narrator's heaven is inside of a house that belongs to, or at least once belonged to the person he's singing to, which is likely a lover of his, whether past or present. However, we're not told, and therefore we need more information, so let's keep going. "And on my deathbed," the second verse begins, "I will pray to the gods and the angels like a pagan, to anyone who will take me to heaven, to a place I recall. I was there so long ago. The sky was bruised, the wine was bled, and there you led me on." So, here we're given a little more information to work with. First of all, we're now learning this house our narrator wants to spend eternity in exists deep within his memory. That is, it doesn't only exist in a specific place, but also in a specific time, a specific day, in fact. He poetically paints us a picture of the scene, describing the sky as bruised, possibly referring to a purplish dusk or a sky peppered with dark clouds. And he recalls that he and this mystery person he wishes to spend eternity with were drinking wine, which infers it was a time of celebration of some sort, even if only a celebration of each other's company. This certainly reinforces the assumption that he's singing to a lover. I'd even go so far as to speculate a former lover from his distant past, someone from, as he puts it, long ago. Also of note here, like the first verse's intentional use of the word confess, is the biblical motif that continues to linger through the narrative, most notably here with the idea of wine being bled, an obvious reference to the Eucharist. That isn't to say that this is a Christian anthem of any sort. To the contrary, our narrator is sure to point out he's praying to any and all possible gods to grant him his wish. But, be that as it may, the themes and terminology being used throughout these verses are clear-cut Christian in nature, as that's the predominant cultural spirituality of the West, which is to say, it's the brand of spirituality Chris Cornell, our songwriter, was raised around. He went to Catholic school. So when dealing with a concept such as the afterlife, these are the overtones he and his audience are most naturally tuned to resonate and identify with. We'd also be remiss not to recognize another, very clever lyrical device being used in this verse. Notice how the last line of this verse feeds into the first line of the chorus, "And there you led me on in your house." The "in your house" line then goes into the second line of the chorus, "I long to be." That is, "In your house I long to be." So then, the "in your house" line works as a bridge between the two stanzas, with both the previous line that finished the verse and the line which follows it in the chorus being grammatically coherent, yet the three lines don't grammatically work all together. It's a very interesting technique, and quite noteworthy, because it's used again in the song's next stanza, when our narrator brings us back to the hotel room and says, "And on I read until the day was gone, and I sat in regret of all the things I've done, for all that I've blessed and all that I've wronged. In dreams until my death, I will wander on." Then, like in the previous verse, this stanza continues into the first line of the chorus, making it, "I will wander on in your house." The "in your house" line acting once again as a bridge between the separate dialogues of the two stanzas, "I will wander on in your house" and "in your house I long to be." In any event, narrative-wise, we're back where we began, with our protagonist, be that Chris or a character of his making, in his hotel room reading a book of death while contemplating his own, all day long. And in that existential state of mind, he reflects on his entire life, all the things he's done right and all the things that he's done wrong, and repents in the name of his dream to return to that happiest of places and times. "In your house I long to be, room by room, patiently I'll wait for you there like a stone, I'll wait for you there alone." So then, this brings us back to our original question. Who is Like a Stone about? A fictional character or Chris Cornell himself? Well, while the song was being worked on, Audioslave bassist Tim Comerford took Like a Stone to be a love song, but later walked away from a conversation with Chris under the impression that it was about an elderly man waiting to die, only later to explain in an interview, "It's like a guy waiting alone in a house of death and all his friends are dying and he's just waiting there, and I'm picturing this man in a rocking chair waiting to die." Many Audioslave fans have since taken this statement as gospel. However, upon dissecting the lyrics line by line, as we just have, that scenario doesn't stand the test of scrutiny. There is no mention of any of our narrator's friends dying anywhere in the lyrics. It's not even hinted at. Nobody else, other than who the narrator is singing to and the narrator himself, is alluded to. Moreover, there is no mention of our narrator being in a rocking chair. There is no mention of our narrator waiting for death. He's only thinking of where he wants to go when he dies, where he'll wait for whoever he's singing to join him. Nor, most importantly, is our narrator in the house the song is about. As he says repeatedly, he longs to be in that house after death. And as we saw Chris say earlier, the narrator is in a hotel room. The house, as Chris also said, is that man's heaven. So then, even if Chris happened to allude to Tim that the song was about an old man in his house on his deathbed, and we don't know if that's the case, but even if he did, he most likely led him astray to deflect from a very real and very personal issue that he was writing about. After all, when this song was recorded, the two hardly knew each other, which is to say, Chris likely wouldn't have told him the truth if the truth was what I suspect to be the case. And what I suspect is that this song is about Chris himself and a very painful issue he was dealing with personally. Anyone who followed Chris Cornell's career knows that, sadly, the topic of death, in fact, the topic of ending one's own life, was a common thread in his art since the beginning. With lyrics such as, "Nothing seems to kill me no matter how hard I try," "I fell on black days, how would I know that this would be my fate?" "It's just the end of the world in me," "Pretty noose is pretty pain," "All I can do to stay me is step off of the edge," among many, many others. The topic of Chris's own death is, it could be easily argued, his artistic signature, at least thematically. So when Like a Stone's lyrics begin by saying, "In a room by a freeway, I was lost in the pages of a book full of death," we really don't need to read too deeply into these lines and guess at who they're referring to. In other words, when Chris uses the word "I" in this case, a riddle doesn't need to be solved. He's referring to himself. After all, these lyrics were written as Chris was in a deep depression, as he and his first wife, Susan Silver, a likely candidate for who this song is about, were in the midst of their marriage falling apart, which a few years later would end in divorce, and as he was drinking so heavily that he eventually needed to enter rehab. Moreover, in the dreadful cases where someone takes their own life, it usually comes after fighting the urge off many times in the past and for many years. Here we have Chris Cornell, a man who so tragically did such a thing in a hotel room by a freeway, singing about thinking of his own death in that exact situation years before it happened. Perhaps those lonely hours in his rooms on tour were the hardest times of Chris's life, where morbid, existentially depressing thoughts plagued him. After all, he told his wife that fateful night that he'd taken one too many anti-anxiety pills to help him maintain, suggesting his mind state that night wasn't a one-off situation, but more likely a pattern that he was trying to medicate himself through. And this isn't to say Like a Stone is about taking one's own life, but it is to point out that Chris certainly did contemplate death when alone in his hotel rooms on tour, once, in the very least, quite verifiably, when those thoughts seemed to have sadly overtaken him, meaning this song's overall theme is quite likely pulled from personal experience. And if it is, as a lifelong fan of Chris Cornell's amazing talent to make beautiful, soul-affecting music, I hope and pray he found that heaven he dreamed of. And that, I'd submit, is truly what Like a Stone is about. One man's heaven. One man's happiest of all thoughts. A love song dedicated to the one person he wished to share that happiest of thoughts with beyond the depths of forever. Like I said before, morbid, sad, yet beautiful. But of course, that's just one opinion, and I'd love to know what you think Like a Stone is about by leaving your thoughts in the comments section below. And while you're at it, let me know what songs you'd like to see covered on Lyristoric. You can also help the channel out greatly by simply giving this video a like and/or a share. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button to keep up with all future Lyristoric content. You won't regret it. Until next time.